how to buy antique swords, and perhaps more importantly, where to find them, is one of those questions that crops up all of the time. And it may be third in line of the most asked questions on like social media or online forums, maybe only after the, please identify this, and it's usually it made in India reproduction saber, or is this authentic or not sword, and then it's usually again a made in India reproduction saber. So third in line, in my experience, maybe not, but it happens often, is the question about where to source antiques. And this, obviously, who's asking these questions are people who are yet to begin collecting, or maybe they're at the very start of their collecting journey. And the reason why I got inspired to make this video, actually, is because I recently rewatched an old video of Matt Easton's. This is a video on exactly this topic, so where to find antique swords, I think it's called. I don't remember exactly the title. But it's an old video by now. It's 9 years old. And I got inspired to make it because when I first watched that video, I was on the other side of the collector's barricades, so to speak. So I was one of the people who was hoping to start their collection. And, you know, just looking up information on swords, just kind of binging on a lot of sword media and thinking, wow, this would be really cool to be able to start myself. And I think maybe, well, 9 years have passed since Matt made his video. So I think maybe I can add my perspective a bit as a homage to how his video influenced my collecting habits, and also maybe to bring some new, fresh point of view, especially considering that he's in the UK, and maybe I can bring a more continental European, so to speak, perspective. And things aren't that different, but they do change a little. And since this video is mostly meant for beginners or people who have yet to begin their collection, I want to start, I think, by describing my feelings when I was in the position you may be in right now. So when I was on the other side of the collecting barricade, so to speak, and I was watching Matt's video 9 years ago, or whenever it was that I first watched it. And that feeling was of initially disappointment, or I felt a little bit of a sting when he mentioned that he would not mention or release specific information on where you could find swords. And that felt, to me, as a person who aspired to be in the collector's environment, in the community perhaps, it felt as a, you are on the other side of the thing, and I will not share that information with you. And also the reason why initially felt to me, I have to say, it did sting a little, was the not wanting to increase competition in the market. And again, as a person who wanted to be part of that community, feeling like there was an obstacle put in front of me just felt like, ooh, this is not very cool. Well, the more time went by, and the more time still goes by, the more I feel instead like the position he had in his video was a very wise one. And this is for a series of reasons, one of which is the one he mentions. So I think nobody wants to damage their own chances of buying or acquiring the sword of their dreams, perhaps. So that does make sense. But this reason isn't maybe even the most important. I think more importantly, there's an aspect of learning curve, like a barrier to entry, so to speak. Sword collecting, probably as most antiques, is a rather risky kind of activity. One, because they may be sharp and pointy, so you can get hurt, but that's not what I'm talking about here. There's a risk of throwing money away that is quite considerable. And I think when you talk to any collector or most collectors, they will have some stories of bad experiences they had when buying. And this is because there are a lot of fakes, malicious or not. So malicious are fakes that are actually made to be a counterfeit of an antique sword and are sold as antiques. But there are also a lot of labeled swords, not correctly described. There may be swords sold as one model where there's something else. There are swords that are composites and they're not sold as composites. There are swords that are in horrible relic conditions, but people still put high prices on them because, oh, well, it's antique, so it must be valuable. So there are a lot of chances and opportunities for beginners to end up throwing a lot of money away and get financially or maybe emotionally hurt in the process. And this isn't to say that experienced collectors need to be the guardians of beginners, so it's not that there's an invitation to gatekeep new collectors from making these mistakes, but it's the fact that perhaps explaining why or pushing beginner collectors in a way to do their own research and to determine for themselves which resources are worth their time and money and which swords are worth their effort and research is perhaps one of the most valuable assets that you as a beginner can invest in. So being able to train your eye on thousands of auction listings and blurry photos, maybe incomplete descriptions, all of this determines your experience, your level of comfort later on in being able to determine whether a sword is worth your money and whether you should bid on it or buy it or not. And this will save you a huge amount of mistakes as time goes by. So consider it almost as a tutorial phase, let's say. Another reason I think is almost more of an ethical one, and it's that when you suggest a specific resource, it feels like you're almost endorsing it. And even the most honest and careful sellers may incur in mistakes. So even in the best of faith, it's possible that something is incorrectly labeled, especially in auction houses where there's a lot of volume going through very frequently during the year. So it's quite easy that something slips through the cracks. And by endorsing something literally, by saying, hey, go to this website and trust them because they're great, I find that that is potentially a risky thing to do. Not legally, in the sense that you can just put a disclaimer there and say this is not real advice, but sending a bunch of beginners to throw money on things that may not be worth it doesn't feel right. And one last reason is that, again, what you communicate influences people, especially when they're people that are trying to get into or trying to start an activity, a hobby, or whatever. And there are lots of different channels you can buy swords from or at. And what works for one person may not work as well for another. So by suggesting the list of things of places where I buy my swords, or where Matt Easton buys them, or where whoever buys their swords, you are kind of closing the opportunity to people for research into other channels and options. So I can give you one example, for instance. I've never had a experience with eBay buying antique swords. I know that a lot of people swear on it as a great way, or as a way to occasionally find really good deals, but it's never really worked for me. And this may be because of where I live. There might be geographical differences. It may be an algorithm thing. It may be that I'm just unlucky when I search, but it never worked for me. So me suggesting eBay or not suggesting it would kind of take away from your opportunity as an individual to make your own experience and figure out for yourself which channels are the best for the way you want to collect. So with all this being said, I hope this doesn't mean a lot of you beginner or hopeful collectors out there don't feel too disappointed by the fact I'm not going to share specific resources. But I perhaps hope that in 9 years, maybe you can come back to this video and say, okay, that was good advice. So let's dive into the where you can find antique swords. So the first method is almost a little bit of a joke. And this would be finding a sword. Some people are lucky enough that they go walk out in the Norwegian wilderness or by the seaside in Israel, and they find a medieval sword just lying in a bog or under the sea. This happens. It's not common, but it does happen. And let's say, depending on where you live, it may be more frequent than not. So obviously, if you live nearby a town where a bunch of Napoleonic battles were fought, it's easier that you may find a sword there than somewhere where they didn't happen. It's easier with more recent things, so like bayonets can actually be fairly easy to find, medieval swords not so much. And it may be easier if you have a certain freedom to metal detect legally, rather than in places where you can't do that. But realistically speaking, finding a sword in the wild is a little more akin to winning the lottery than to collecting. And while it may sound like it's in the same kind of vibe as the first channel I mentioned, the second is actually looking in attics, basements, sheds, in your grandparents' house, old family friends, anywhere where things have been stored for decades and kind of forgot, and where you obviously have legal access and permission to look. But you would be surprised at how possibly easy it is to find swords in these environments. Now, it's not to say that every single shed has one, but just speaking from personal experience, I have actually 3 different ways in my family I've had swords around me when I was a kid. So one is my father's service saber from when he did his military service. One is my maternal grandfather's saber too. He had his own sword from his military service, so this is a little older, from World War II era. And the third is actually, and this is something that I am extremely sad about because I do not have them, but in my paternal grandfather's house when I was a kid, there were a bunch of tulwars. These were antiques, and I know they were there because I used to play with them as a kid. They were just kind of hanging around. Unfortunately, I don't know where these went because as people, passed away and moved and things got lost over time, and I don't know where they are. But just to show that, let's say if I had been a collector at the time when I was a kid, I would have had access to like a bunch of swords just looking around in my immediate family. Of course, this will depend on different situations. Not everywhere has perhaps the same concentration of swords, but it's really not as rare as you may think. So keep a sharp eye out, literal and pointy eye out, and you may find what you're looking for. With these 2 more like luck-based perhaps methods out of the way, we can focus on the more the ones you can actually research and learn about and action yourself. And the first one is auction houses. So auction houses come in a whole bunch of varieties. They're from like really big luxury-based auction houses to really small local ones. Some are more like estate sale management, and some instead specialize, for instance, in antique weapons. So you can find the whole gamut, and you want to try and leverage those things as much as you can within your power. Now, why would someone buy at auction houses? The first reason is that they take a lot of the research work away from you. So they're the ones that actually source all of these swords from different barns, sheds, collections, concentrate them all in one place and one time, and there you get to spending, investing a couple of hours in an auction. You may come home with a bunch of swords rather than having to go fish them out on your own. So that's one reason. 2 is that, at least for the specialized auction houses, there's usually already a filter. So you kind of, someone is in charge at least of estimating the, obviously an auction house wants to make money on authentic things and increasing the value of the auction itself. So the more things are authentic and can be sold easily because they're real, the better it is for the auction house. So there is a first filter there. It doesn't always work. And this is also not true for smaller or local auction houses. These may not know what they have. It's just sword for sale or something. And they have a high volume, and it's you can schedule your buying, so you kind of know the cadence of these auctions. Usually they happen a few times a year, and you can kind of save, for example, enough money to be able to get to the auction and buy what you want. And you can actually make some pretty sweet deals. So sometimes things aren't properly labeled or recognized, and if you have a trained eye, as I mentioned, you may be able to find something that other people have not noticed. And lots of times, to invite offers at the start to excite people for the auction, the initial prices are actually relatively low. So if something by any chance, there's a lot of luck in this too, but if by any chance something doesn't receive a lot of offers, sometimes you get to bring something home for a decent price. However, these are the pros. There are also some cons. So the cons are there are a lot of extra costs involved. So the reason why initial prices at auctions are lower is perhaps to invite people to buy, and you can make some deals as I mentioned, but it's also because you have to add to that a buyer's fee, like a fee that goes to the auction house. And this can vary from 20% if you're really, really lucky. And recently I've seen things go for like over 30%. So that means that you have a very, very high markup on the final price of what you buy. And this can get out of control really easily. Another thing is complexity. It's easy to buy at auction. You just have to raise your hand or click a button if you're buying online. But that implies that you're already in the auction. To be approved in many auction houses is a little more complicated than your average Amazon or eBay purchase. So what happens is they all have their own process. Each auction house has their own registration process. You usually have to be registered as a client. You don't just show up and bid. And this means that you may be required to share your credit card number, which you may not want to do, or maybe you may not have. You may be required to share ID, depending on where in the world you are and what legal requirements there are to sell and buy weapons, which again, not everyone is comfortable doing. There may be approval time involved. So for example, it may take a couple of days for you to be approved for a specific auction, which if you wake up at the last minute, is just not going to happen. There may be credit limits involved. So you may be approved for a certain amount and not more. So there's a whole bunch of different requirements each auction house has, and you need to kind of navigate these ahead of time. So you need to have a kind of your calendar, know when auctions are upcoming, which ones you're interested in. You don't just jump into them. So there's some complexity. Another thing is competition. So the fact that auction houses kind of aggregate all these swords, they do all the groundwork for you, they collect everything in a place, in a time, and then enable you to buy with relative ease. And usually there's someone curating and verifying the objects, and you're guaranteed that they will ship at least. These things obviously attract people because it's just easy and relatively safe. So don't expect to show up whether online or in real life at an auction and just kind of bag a whole bunch of like swords that no one thought about and just walk out with pennies on the dollar. Another point is that auction houses can be shady. A lot of them aren't. Many are very serious. Many are even super specialized in antique weapons, so there's that too. But some aren't, and some, as I mentioned earlier, may make mistakes in good faith, and some just don't and misrepresent what they're selling. So that's something to keep in mind. So ultimately, I would say auction houses on a scale, let's say, of who usually makes good use or who can leverage auction houses the most, I would say it's probably the more experienced kind of collector. This is not to scare you away from auctions as a beginner, but keep in mind that there's a learning curve to participating in auctions. And so either more experienced collectors or people with a lot of money. So if you have $20,000 or euro and want to buy a sword with absolute attribution and provenance that's being sold at some world-renowned auction house, go for it. Why not? Another interesting channel for beginners can be dealers, specialized dealers. So again, Matt Easton went through this already, but it's still true 10 years later. Dealers are a great source for legit swords. This usually, however, comes at a premium. So the fact that they're doing the specific work, not only of the auction house who acts as a middle person between sellers and buyers and takes a fee, but the fact that they actually, usually dealers have to acquire the swords, store them, hold them for who knows how long until someone buys them, promote them. This means obviously there's a considerable markup on prices you may find in the wild if you know where to look. However, that price in that price, you pay a guarantee, usually, of authenticity and of seriousness of the seller. So if you don't know where to start, a dealer is often a very good choice if you're willing to pay that premium. So again, this is one of those cases where perhaps you can mention names. So I think Matt Easton is actually one of the dealers that everyone would probably be able to endorse safely. Another one in the UK is Thierry, the sword guy. And I'm sure there are a lot of others. I don't usually buy from dealers, so I can't really give you my personal experienced endorsements, but it is a great way to, and it's also a really good way to get into the community, to start having a direct relationship with people who have a lot of experience and who can share that experience more than an auction house would be able to do. However, there are limitations to dealers as well. One, let's not consider price a limitation because you're paying for a service that is useful and valuable. But one limitation is that they're not always visible. So some have websites, as Matt Easton does and as Thierry the Sword Guy, which is why I know them. Matt Ford too, by the way. And others are more active in communities. You may find some on message boards and forums that are dedicated to swords, for example. And it might be hard sometimes to understand who is a random seller from someone who is a legit dealer, but usually if you just dive into a forum or a community, you'll be able to quickly be pointed to who the reliable sources for swords are. And yeah, so visibility may be a little tricky. And maybe another drawback of buying from a dealer, perhaps, I don't know, this is maybe a personal thing, but is it kind of strips away the adventure aspect a little. So there's something really cool about buying a sword that you hope is going to be what you kind of spotted by just looking at it in pictures. You may think you saw some features, or it's in better condition than the seller thinks it is, or it's something more special than. There's an adventurous side to hunting for swords, and when you simply go to a store and buy one, or go to a dealer and buy one, maybe that takes that adventure away. That's really a very personal experience kind of thing. So for me, I think that counts. For you, you may be super happy to just go and buy it. The fifth option is marketplaces. Marketplaces are basically the Wild West when it comes to buying and selling. There are no real rules. There are, except for the ones on the platform, or legal laws wherever you're located. But marketplaces, you can find a lot of very, very cool stuff. You can find swords that are sold way below their value because maybe people are just getting rid of them, or they don't care about them, or they don't know what it is. You can also, though, find a lot of garbage that would absolutely be filtered away in an auction house or at a dealer. So this is really, again, an environment where you need to know where you're moving, what steps you're taking, because the risk of overpaying or buying garbage is really, really high. Moreover, you have no guarantees. So for example, a lot of auction houses will take objects back if you can prove within a certain time that it was not what they described. So hypothetically, worst case scenario, they sell something that is sold as an authentic 19th century sword, and it turns out that it's a 20th century reproduction. If you can prove that within a certain time, many auction houses will cover that. And this is not going to happen on a public marketplace. And when I'm talking about marketplaces, there are kind of maybe two. The more risky one is the general marketplace. So imagine your local version of Craigslist or eBay, for example. So each country usually has its own, or a variety of its own. So these are the ones where just stuff gets sold. You can find swords depending on where you are, but there's no guarantee. Other marketplaces which you can usually trust more are marketplaces in specialized forums. So there are a whole bunch of forums where people discuss swords, and this can be on social media like Facebook groups or stuff, or it can be just on websites like Sword Buyer's Guide or My Armory Forum used to have it, I think. So you usually have a buy and sell section, so you can check those out as well. These are kind of where you can find swords. Oh, and one last thing would be at antique shops locally. But this, of course, limits your scope of search to wherever you're living and kind of the distance you're willing to travel. and not everywhere will have them. This is really kind of a luck. You go somewhere and, you know, among a bunch of canes and umbrellas in an umbrella holder, there may be a saber. So for most of these, I would say the ones that require the most experience for different reasons are the auction house, because just the complexity of the process, relative complexity of the process, requires you ideally to be a little bit to know where you're standing. And the marketplaces, on the other hand, where it's best if you know what you're doing, just because of the chaos that a marketplace can be. If you want to go for the safe choice, the dealer is safe choice always. And the perhaps second best would be specialized groups, where you can find some cool stuff as well. All of these, you're going to have to pay some money. Matt Easton, the prices he mentions in his video actually have not changed that much, surprisingly, in these last 10 years. The low range of swords is still between 150 or 200. I would say that his range is actually spot on even 10 years later. So between 200 and 500 or 600, you can find a whole broad range of really cool stuff. If you find anything below, you're lucky and it's a deal. And anything above, it's better if it's something that you know what it is and you're putting in the money because you want that expensive object. One last thing that perhaps can help is geographical distribution of swords is not equal. So not every location has the same amount of offer. You can take this in different ways. One is by country. So bigger countries that, especially in the 19th century, had bigger armies, will have more swords on the market. So if we look at France, Germany, and the UK, there's a lot on the market. And within these countries, obviously, there are areas where you can find more swords than others. More remote areas, it'll be harder. If you're in an area where there's a lot of antique dealers or big cities, probably you're going to find more. There's also an aspect of regulations. So not every country has equal freedom to freely sell without permits or stuff, antique weapons. So in some countries, there may be high volume of them. I'm thinking of Italy, for example, where historically there are a lot of swords, but they're not on the open market usually. So depending on where you are, you may actually be limited only to auction houses or dealers, or have access to the marketplace and like the open free market. So that really depends, and it's something that you need to look up for yourself and understand the landscape you're operating in. So anyway, I hope I gave you a bunch of information. Hopefully there's something new compared to what you already knew, or what information was already available to you. And if you're in the process of beginning your collection or kind of diving into it, I really hope it's a successful one. I hope that, yeah, all of this helped you and that you can kind of do your research and your first sword purchase can be a really cool one that you hang on to for a long time. So thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.